Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Introduction to the Global Internal Audit Standards webinar. I will be your moderator, Hillary Collier. I'm an audit partner here in Atlanta. But before we get started, we want to go over some kind of housekeeping stuff to be able to get your CPE certification. We're offering 1 hour credit for this 50 minutes of study. There's no partial CPE credit offered for this event, so make sure you stay on. Please log in with your unique link that you received via email and stay logged in the entire webinar. And you must answer 80% of the poll questions to receive the CPE credit. Certificates will be distributed via email within 7 days, and they'll be delivered from this email address here, support@prolara.com. If you have any questions about the certification process, my goodness, can be sent to marketing@cricpa.com. PDF handouts are accessible for download through the Zoom chat that will be posted. So I would like to introduce Doug Mims. He is a CPA. He's also a certified internal auditor here. He's in the Atlanta office, and he's one of our financial services subline leader. He has about almost 30 years of internal audit experience, specifically in the financial services area, but he's been a certified internal auditor since 2017.
Okay. Thanks, Hillary. And of course, thanks for kicking us off. And of course, Hillary's here. She's an audit partner here in Atlanta as well. And Hillary, too, is a CIA, having gotten her CIA recently, and she works. She's an integral part of our internal audit team here in Atlanta. So thank you all for joining us today for an overview of the Global Internal Audit Standards. Obviously brand new, issued January the 9th in final form. So we're going to come truly give you an introduction, be high level, but we'll try to cover all the required components of that. So first thing we'll do today is have an overview and timeline. Then we'll go over the fundamentals of the Global Internal Audit Standards, the structure of the standards, which I think is important. We'll also cover the domains, which is part of the structure. We'll go over domain 1, the purpose of account internal auditing, domain 2, ethics and professionalism, domain 3, which is governing the IA function, domain 4, which is managing, and then domain 5, which is performing internal audit services. And I think typically the most relevant portion, that's probably a bad way to say that, some of the information in, say, domain 2 is kind of intuitive, and it's things that were already in the IPPF. Some of the things about practice are a little more relevant. So I'll move briskly through probably the first part, and then we'll try to slow it down a little bit, but a lot of ground to cover. So if we don't make it all the way through, we do have you do have access to the slide deck, and it's an abbreviation of what's in the actual standard. So the IPPF, which is what we're all currently adhering to, was updated last in 2017. And so the IA Board of Directors, Global Board, decided it was time for an update, as did the membership. And so the Global Internal Audit Standards were issued in March of 2023 in a draft form. And we'll talk a little bit about the public comment period and kind of the results of that. But there was a public comment period, and it lasted for approximately 2 months till May 30th. And then that culminated in the issuance of the final standards. But just a note here, everything herein, there's very little opinion. Quite frankly, it's an extraction from those standards. So everything that we're talking about today came from the Global Internal Audit Standards, and any opinions and whatnot would be that of myself and not necessarily even our firm. So the survey was made available on the IA site in 22 languages. And I didn't know this until I actually looked this up. There's 250,000 members in the IA worldwide. So I was curious about that when I was looking at some of these stats. But so over 1,600 completed surveys, and that contained 19,000 specific comments, so pretty robust. 69% of the comments were from outside of North America. And 418 of the survey responses were on behalf of organizations. For instance, I responded on behalf of Carr, and Ingram. But collectively, and this is actually why I looked up the membership, they estimate that it addressed the totality of the responses represented 110,000 people. So 110,000 of 250,000 members. So that's pretty strong, I would think. So the final standards, as I mentioned, issued on January the 9th. A complimentary report was issued, report on the standard setting and public comment processes for the Global Internal Audit Standards. And I'll refer to those as the standards, so I don't have to keep saying the Global Internal Audit Standards. But that document is interesting because it talks about the feedback, where the feedback came from, the nature of the feedback, and what changes were made in direct response to the feedback. And there were relevant changes made. I went through the document and we did some training on the draft document, and so the final document did have relevant changes throughout from that feedback. So, but it tells that story in full. So the fundamentals of the standards, it talks about the public interest, and that it encompasses the social and economic interest and overall well-being of society and the organizations operating within society. It talks about internal audit's critical role in enhancing an organization's ability to serve the public interest. Public interest is built into the standards and the importance of that. And it also, the IA is committed to setting standards with input from the public and to the benefit of the public. Applicability of the standards is important. The standards apply to any individual or function that provides internal audit services. So it doesn't matter if you're with a CPA firm, or you're an independent consultant, or you're in the internal audit function in a company in Europe. Doesn't matter. If you provide internal audit services, the standards are applicable to you. That means if you're not a CIA, standards are still applicable to you. So anybody who provides internal audit services, it applies to you. The standards use the words must in the requirements section and the words should and may to specify common and preferred practices in the considerations for implementation section. That's a carryover from the draft, but today what we're going to cover is just the requirements section. And so the document in totality is about 120 pages. They put out another complimentary document, which I didn't realize until recently, that just includes the requirements, and it's about half that size. So it's about 60 pages. So it's a reduced, kind of gets to the point and for the practitioner. So I think that'll be a valuable document for a lot of folks. But so we'll focus on the things that you must do today in our overview. Other things that are in the standards include a list of examples of evidence of conformance. There's a glossary that you are supposed to read and understand as a critical component of an integrated part of the standards. So, and that's in the front, not the back. So demonstrating conformance with standards is addressed. Application in small internal audit function is addressed, as is application in the public sector. That's actually at the end of the document. There's reference to it in the front, but it's also at the end of the document. And but we're not covering that aspect today. We're going to stick to the audit stuff, if you will. Okay, so here's the structure. So domain 1 is the purpose of internal auditing. Domain 2 is ethics and professionalism, which I said before, but you can see the principles, but this is in the slides. I won't go through every one, but you can kind of see how it goes through the principles that support each domain, and then standards supporting the principles. And we're going to touch on each of the standards supporting the principles as we go through here. So there's, I don't know that I counted them, but I think there's about 50 standards built in here, but some of them are intuitive and straightforward. So authorized by the board, positioned independently, overseen by the board. We'll go through that and talk about what those mean in the governance section. Managing the internal audit function, strategy, resources, communication, commitment to quality, those types of things embedded in those principles. And then domain 5, performing internal audit services. And that goes into the more of the hands-on, roll up your sleeves, things that you do on a day-to-day. So each standard includes requirements as well as considerations for implementation and examples of evidence of conformance, which is what I mentioned previously. And with that, we're to a poll question.
Okay, I will launch the poll question. And just to let everyone know, we have 4 poll questions today. So like we said, we need to get 85 to 75% of them, answer 3 to get your CPE credit. Doug, if you want to go ahead and keep going, I'll just leave this up here so people can answer since they're.
Obviously, these are not technical.
That's right. Generic kind of questions.
Questions so you can get your CPE. See if I can. Okay, so drop it down. Domain 1, purpose of internal auditing. What's the purpose? Internal auditing strengthens the organization's ability to create, protect, and sustain value by providing the board and management with independent, risk-based, and objective assurance, advice, insight, and foresight. So that's the goal of internal audit. In a nutshell, it's independent, risk-based assurance, but also consultative advice, insight, and foresight, and really to add value to the organization. That's the ultimate goal. Internal audit strengthens organizations' successful achievement of its objectives, governance, risk management, and control processes. So when I say GRC, and I think everybody on here probably knows GRC is governance, risk management, control. I may abbreviate that as we go. Decision-making and oversight, reputation and credibility with its stakeholders, and ability to serve the public interest. We do already have, I do see there's a question in the Q&A, Hillary. You see that? I don't know what it is. Internal auditing is most effective when it's performed by competent professionals who in conformance with the standards, in consideration of the public interest. Internal audit is independently positioned with direct accountability to the board. So independently positioned in the organization. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. And internal auditors are free of undue influence and committed to making objective assessments. So that's the continuation of the purpose statement of internal audit. Domain 2, ethics and professionalism. So clearly the smallest, shortest, maybe the most important, but the most brief portion of the standard is domain 1. And domain 2 gets into ethics and professionalism. So we'll go through each of these standards. And again, some of these are intuitive. They're also duplicative with what's already been out there to a large degree, maybe not word for word, but certainly conceptually. So we'll kind of talk through these. So honesty and professional courage. Internal auditors must perform their work with honesty and professional courage, must be truthful, accurate, clear, open, and respectful. Must exhibit courage by communicating truthfully and taking appropriate action when confronted by dilemmas and difficult situations. So clearly the courage part is being willing to have hard conversations. And if you have an issue and you've supported that issue, then, stand your ground and reporting that from an integritous viewpoint rather than giving in to the pressure. And hey, there certainly are audits that we've all been on or will be on where sometimes the recipient of the recommendation is not happy about it. And so sometimes you do have to stand your ground. And so that's the professional courage aspect of it. Internal auditors must understand, respect, and meet and contribute to the legitimate and ethical expectations of the organization. And internal auditors should encourage and promote an ethics-based culture in the organization. So that's standard 2. And I won't dwell on these. I'll hit them and move on. Internal auditors must not engage or be imparted in any activity that's illegal or discreditable to the profession. They must understand and abide relevant laws and regulations and must identify, if they identify legal or regulatory violations, they must report such incidents. So in the context of your work, if you find something that's legal in nature or regulatory and it constitutes violations, then you must report it in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so moving on then, principle 2, maintain objectivity. Standard 2.1, individual objectivity. Internal auditors have to maintain objectivity. Professional objectivity requires internal auditors to apply an impartial and unbiased mindset and make judgments based on balanced assessments of relevant circumstances. So taking things in full context and in totality. And internal auditors must be aware of and manage potential biases. So there's certainly potential biases in everything we all do and every thought we have. So need to consider those as a professional when you're conducting an internal audit. Internal auditors must recognize and avoid or mitigate actual, potential, or perceived impairments to objectivity. So you need to be objective, and you need to be recognize when there's potential issues around that. Internal auditors must not accept any tangible or intangible item that may impair or be presumed to impair objectivity. And internal auditors must avoid conflicts of interest and not be unduly influenced by their own interests or the interest of others. So objectivity doesn't say independence. It may say that somewhere. I don't have it in the slide, but objectivity is the primary focus. A lot of times internal audit functions are within an organization. You're obviously being paid by that organization. So I guess it'd be difficult to assert that you're independent, but you can certainly be objective. Standard 2.3, if there's any issues with objectivity and it's been impaired in fact or appearance, that should be disclosed if you're an internal auditor. And presumably if you have a chief audit executive or similar, you would disclose that to them and let them take action accordingly. Principle 3.3 is demonstrate competency. So standard 3.1 is competency. Internal auditors must possess or obtain the competence to perform their responsibilities successfully, and they must engage in only those services for which they have or can attain the necessary competency. So we've all had internal audits where we're all stronger in some places, have more experience in some than others, but if you don't have the requisite skill and knowledge to effectively execute an internal audit, then you need to raise your hand and say that, or you need to go about obtaining the skill set in order to be able to effectively carry out your duty. CPE, internal auditors must be committed to CPE and continuing to develop. There actually was an hours requirement. I think it said a minimum of 20 hours in the draft, but they appear to have dropped that. I think essentially internal auditors should seek to obtain appropriate CPE on an annual basis. And if you have certain certifications that require CPE, then you should adhere to those standards at a minimum on an annual basis. Principle 4, exercise due professional care. So internal auditors must plan and perform standards services in accordance with the global standards. Internal audit functions methodologies must be established, documented, and maintained in alignment with the standards. So exercising due professional care, standard 4.1. Continuing some of the things that internal auditors must do to demonstrate due professional care. You have to take into account the organization's strategy and objectives, the best interest of the auditee and the stakeholder, adequacy of governance, risk, and control, the cost in relation to benefit. That's an interesting one. So, you gotta be efficient in what you're doing. Extent and timeliness of work needed, relative complexity, materiality, or risk, probability of significant errors, fraud, and compliance, and uses of appropriate techniques, tools, and technology. So in short, due professional care encompasses a lot of things, but you have to consider your organization, you have to consider your stakeholders, you have to consider governance, risk, and controls, and perform your duties with consideration of all those things under standard 4.2. Standard 4.3, professional skepticism. So this is not auditors this is a common phrase with auditors, regardless of what type of auditor you are. Professional skepticism, you have to maintain an attitude that includes inquisitiveness, critically assess the reliability of information. That's actually a recurring theme, is not just that you consider everything, all relevant facts and things of that nature, but the reliability of the information you're using in your audits, being straightforward and honest when raising concerns and asking questions, and seek additional evidence to make a judgment about information statements that might be incomplete, inconsistent, false, or misleading. So if you don't have all the facts, you need to continue until you get to a level of support for what you're doing that supports the objective of the internal audit, standard 4.3. Okay, so moving to principle 5, maintain confidentiality. Standard 5.1 talks about the use of information, and really you must follow the policies and procedures and laws and regs that apply. And you shouldn't use any of the information you gain in an internal audit for personal gain or any other manner contrary or detrimental to the organization's legitimate and ethical objectives. So you have to you be a professional as it relates to the use of information. Standard 5.2 talks about protecting information, which is a big deal for all of us these days, whether it's from a cyber perspective or making sure you secure your laptop and store it somewhere where it can't be easily taken and things of that nature. So internal auditors must be aware of your responsibility to protect information and take steps to do it in all respects. All right, poll question. Number 2.
Thanks, Doug. And somebody had a question about, which I thought we could answer live because it may pertain to other people, but basically they have an employee that came from engineering and they want to be in the internal audit group. And is there a period where they cannot audit what they were previously involved in? And it's 12 months is what I've looked it up on the standards. And it basically says the internal auditors must refrain from assessing specific activities for which they were previously responsible for within the previous 12 months.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
That sounds so yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think there's judgment in that about, I don't think 12 months is a hard line. I also think it depends on that person's roles and responsibilities. If they were in a department versus saying managing the department.
Right. Yeah.
I think there's some judgment in that, but it sounds like the standards do directly. I don't think that's in our slides, but it's probably in some of the explanatory language, but that sounds like a good rule of thumb.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. You want to continue?
All right, domain 3, governing the internal audit function. So standard 6.1 is the internal audit mandate. And so that the internal audit mandate, which is actually not the internal audit charter, they're interrelated, but they're not the same thing. So, and that's kind of a different twist, if you will. So internal auditor, so what is the mandate? Internal audit's authority, roles, and responsibilities that may be granted by the board or laws and regulations. So that's internal audit's mandate. The CAE, Chief Executive Officer, and I'll use that term, and just to say this, I think everybody probably knows this, but the CAE is whoever's the head of the department. So it could be, your title could be internal auditor, it could be internal audit manager, it could be director of internal audit, it could be chief risk officer, whatever. But whomever is in charge of audit in the organization is the CAE. So it's think of it in that broad terminology. So the CAE must provide the board and senior management with the information necessary to establish the internal audit mandate. What you'll see in this document is that there's a lot of ownership given to the CAE. It doesn't go the other way. It doesn't say, hey, it's the board's job to give the CAE the internal audit mandate. In most every instance, it's the CAE's job to help themselves. And so in this instance, and we'll see it again, the CAE needs to give senior management and the board the information necessary to develop the internal audit mandate. And to help the board and senior management determine the scope and type of internal audit services. Again, the CAE must coordinate with other internal and external assurance providers to gain an understanding of the others' roles and responsibilities. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So however the internal audit's being delivered, a lot of times there are at least some co-sourcing going on, and that plays into the internal audit mandate is a component of it. And the CAE must document or reference the mandate in the internal audit charter, which is approved by the board. So the board has to approve the charter. The charter needs to reference internal audit's mandate and what their role is essentially and responsibilities in the organization. So internal audit charter, that was part of the IPPF, obviously, and much of that remains either the same or similar. The CAE must develop and maintain an internal audit charter that includes the purpose of internal audit, commitment to adherence to standards, the internal audit mandate, and the organizational position and reporting relationships of the internal audit function. From a standpoint of board and senior management support, again, kind of ownership with the CAE. The CAE must provide the board and senior management with information needed to support and promote recognition of the IA function in the organization. And the CAE must also coordinate the internal audit functions, board communications with senior management to support the board's ability to fulfill its requirements. So there's a reference to independent positioning, and obviously there's a reporting to the board, but there's clearly an encouragement here. And I think it may vary by the size of the organization, but there's an encouragement of coordinating with senior management to help better position internal audit to be effective in the organization. Principle 7 is positioned independently, so 7.1 organizational independence. The CAE must confirm to the board the organizational independence of the internal audit function at least annually. And the CAE must document reporting relationships and organizational positioning of internal audit in the internal audit charter. So there's no prescribed way. I know a purist would want direct line to the board and maybe a dotted line to management and other things, but I don't think there's any prescriptive way that it has to be done. But ultimately, internal audit needs to be positioned in a manner that they have access to the board, they have a appropriate working relationship with senior management, and they're able to carry out and meet the internal audit mandate and achieve the objectives in the internal audit mandate in the charter. CAE qualifications. The CAE must help the board understand, again, ownership with the CAE, understand qualifications and competency that the CAE needs to manage internal audit. And the CAE must maintain and enhance their qualifications in order to do that. Principle 8, overseen by the board. Standard 8.1, board interactions. So the CAE must report to the board and senior management. These are some of the things that are in the standard, and these are in the standards, and this is a must. Internal audit plan and budget, changes affecting the mandate or charter, independence issues, results of internal audit services, and results from the quality assurance and improvement program that we'll talk about here in another principle. Again, staying with Principle 8, resources. The CAE must evaluate whether internal audit resources are sufficient. And if they're not, they need to come up with an alternate strategy and inform the board of the impact of insufficient resources. There's a bit of a discussion in the standards about that second bullet that I creatively got that into one concise sentence. So you might want to read that in full, but essentially the CAE needs to find a way. And if you can, and make sure the board's informed. And if you can't find a way, then you need to let the board know you have an issue with resources. Standard 8.3, quality. The CAE has to develop and implement a quality assurance and improvement plan that encompasses everything it should in the audit function. And at least annually, the CAE must communicate the results of the internal audit, the assessment, the internal quality assessment to the board and senior management. So CAE is responsible for quality, and they need to do the internal assessment annually and report that to the board, at least annually. External quality assessment, not to be confused with internal. The CAE must develop a plan for an external quality assessment, and that needs to take place once every 5 years. Interestingly and appropriately, I don't think this was in the IPPF. I'm not even sure this was actually in the draft, but I might have missed it. One of the members of the team that does the assessment has to have an active CIA. So you can't have a bunch of CPAs on the team, 100% or whatever, from a firm doing it, their outside party, or a consultant that's not a CIA. You have to have a CIA, you have to have one member do the quality assessment that is an active CIA. The requirement can also be met through self-assessment with independent validation. I won't go into that. And I think there are going to be some updated quality assessment standards put out. And presumably that will address the independent assessment versus the self-assessment with independent validation, which what is part of the existing world. And one thing I didn't say when we kick this off is the standards are required to be implemented. I believe it's on the 1-year anniversary of the issuance, which is January of 25. Is that right? Yeah, January of 25. So you don't have to implement for 24, even though they came out in January. You have a year to implement these standards, the Global Internal Audit Standards. Okay, poll question number 3, unless I missed one.
Thanks, Doug. Here we go. It's a simple one. Are you still here? Are you still there?
But important.
Yeah, true. True.
Y'all can have fun with that. No, we'll move on. So domain 4, managing the internal audit function. So remember, there's 5 domains. We've gone through 3, and we have 2 to go. And the first is managing the internal audit function. Standard 9.1, understanding governance, risk management, and control processes. And this basically says you have to develop an internal audit strategy, charter, and plan that reflects that the CAE understands the organization's governance, risk management, and control processes, which obviously makes sense. Standard 9.2, the actual internal audit strategy. The CAE has to develop and implement a strategy for the IA function that supports the strategic objective and success of the organization and aligns with the expectations of senior management, the board, and other stakeholders. The strategy must include a vision, strategic objectives, and supporting initiatives. And the CAE must review the internal audit strategy with the board and management periodically. I say periodically, I underline periodically because it doesn't say annually. It just says periodically. So that presumably that could be less than annual, or maybe more than annual. But obviously annually would be the most common approach. So internal audit strategy, CAE owns internal audit strategy, and you have to have them. Methodologies, the CAE has to develop methodologies that guide the IA function in a systemic and disciplined manner to implement the strategy, develop the plan, and conform with the standards. And the CAE must evaluate the effectiveness of these methodologies and provide internal auditors with training on methodology. So you have to have mechanisms in place to ensure that your methodology is achieving the objective. Part of that is the quality assessment, but it might be other things as well. But you also have to make sure, and I abbreviated that blurb as well, but you also have to make sure you train your team on the methodology so that you can be efficient and effective in carrying out your role. The internal audit plan, the CAE has to create a plan that supports the achievement of the organization's objectives and is based on annual assessment of strategies, objectives, and risks. So you have to do an annual risk assessment and develop a plan that aligns with the goals of the company and the objectives of the company. You have to consider the internal audit mandate. You have to specify internal audit services that support governance, risk, and controls. You have to consider coverage of IT governance, fraud risk, compliance, ethics programs, and other high-risk areas. So there is a requirement that you assess IT governance one way or the other in the internal audit plan, that you address fraud risk, that you cover compliance and ethics, and that it is risk-based and focuses on high-risk areas. You have to identify the necessary human, financial, and IT resources. It has to be dynamic and updated timely, and be communicated to the board and senior management initially and on an ongoing basis. So that's the internal audit plan. Standard 9.4. Standard 9.5, coordination and reliance. The CAE must coordinate with internal audit and external providers of assurance services, which you would obviously think you would do that if you have third-party providers. Importantly, when reliance is placed on those providers, if the internal audit function places reliance on third parties, the CAE must document the basis for that reliance. So you can't just engage somebody and have them go out and do work. You got to have a basis for who you select and their qualifications, and then you have to document why you're able to rely on what they're doing as part of carrying out the internal audit mandate as referenced in the charter, as in consideration of your internal audit plan. Okay. Principle 10, managing resource. So standard 10.1, financial resource management. You have to develop a budget that enables, so you, the CAE, in ownership by the CAE has to develop a budget that enables you to implement the strategy and the plan. The budget needs to include necessary resources for the function, but also for training and technology and tools. The CAE needs to manage the day-to-day activities in an effective and efficient way to stay within the budget. And the CAE must seek budget approval from the board. I don't think there was a specificity as to the windows of time, but most companies have budgets that they develop for the coming year. So presumably it would be as part of that budgetary process. Human resource management, the CAE has to establish a program to recruit, develop, and retain internal auditors that can assist in executing the strategy, and they must strive to ensure that human resources are appropriate, sufficient, and are effectively deployed to carry out the audit. I'm into it. Human resource management continues. CAE must communicate with the board regarding the appropriateness of human resources, and the CAE must evaluate the competencies of the individual auditors and encourage professional development. So pretty standard stuff. There's a specific reference to, that says chief, technological resources. That says chief executive officer must. That's chief audit executive. So that's not CEO. That's CAE. As it relates to technology resources, they need to be included in the plan. They need to be included in the budget, and there needs to be a commitment to appropriately incorporating technology into the internal audit function. And that any technology limitations need to be reported to the board and senior management. All right, another poll question. Fifth, is that 5? Is this the 5th one?
We only have 4 today, so this is the last one. All right, I've launched it. Do you want to keep going, Doug?
Have you followed CRI CPA on social media? If you please do.
Oh, that's a good question.
Put out our marketing team puts out a lot of really good information related to a lot of different things.
And
okay, principle 11.
I was just going to say at the end of the slides, we'll have some information about that. So
if I can get you to the end of the slides. Question. Okay, so there's 15 principles, and we're on principle 11. So I'll pick up the pace as we have 21 minutes, so we're pretty good. Okay, so it's the CAE's job to ensure that the audit function builds appropriate relationships and trust with key stakeholders. Who are the key stakeholders? The same as they've always been: the board, senior management, operational management, regulators, and internal and external service providers. It might even be, well, it does say regulators. So that's the CAE's job to effectively do that. Again, under effective communicating effectively, the CAE must establish and implement methodologies to promote accurate, objective, clear, concise, constructive, complete, and timely internal audit communications. That's pretty stout. So CAE needs to have an appropriate communication channels, needs to put those in place and do their best to communicate timely and clearly, but also in a concise manner, which is what we all try to do in that regard. From other otherwise communicating results, the CAE must communicate the results of internal audit services to the board and senior management periodically for each engagement. The results of internal audit services would include engagement conclusions, themes across internal audits, as far as effective practices or root cause issues, as well as conclusions at the level of the business unit or organization. So those are the types of results that you would expect to see conveyed. Errors and omissions, this simply says if you issue something that's incorrect, then you need to, and it's relevant, then you need to reissue it in a timely manner. Standard 11.5, communicating the acceptance of risk. The CAE must communicate unacceptable levels of risk. And when the CAE concludes that management has accepted a level of risk that exceeds the organization's risk appetite, they need to discuss it with senior management. And if the matter can't be resolved, then the CAE must escalate that to the board. So if you identify risk outside of the company's risk tolerance, then that needs to go to senior management, and it needs to be escalated further if that doesn't get resolved there. Principle 12 is enhanced quality, internal quality assessment. So I mentioned this earlier. The CAE must establish methodologies for internal quality assessments that include ongoing monitoring of conformance, periodic self-assessments, communication of results to the board and senior management, and development of action plans to address nonconformance. So you have to have monitoring in place, do the periodic self-assessment, communicate it to the board, and remediate things that need to be improved. Performance measurement, standard 12.2, the CAE has to develop a means to assess performance measurement. That could be a lot of different things. It could be budget to actual, but it also would incorporate feedback from auditees and others. So in fact, the CAE must solicit feedback from the board and senior management as appropriate as it relates to the quality of the service being provided to the organization. Standard 12.3, oversee and improve engagement performance. The CAE or a designee must implement measures for engagement supervision, quality assurance, and competency. So how you carry out, how you supervise engagements and meet the requirements that are developed in really, to me, it starts with the mandate, the charter, and then the actual methodologies that you put in place. How do you measure, monitor? And this, things like work paper review and levels of sign off and such. And so there needs to be the CAE needs to have a process in place for that. The extent of supervision required, of course, is dependent on the complexity of the area and the experience of the person carrying out the internal audit. And the evidence of supervision should be documented and retained. So you should have work papers. They should be appropriately reviewed. You should conform to your methodologies, where they be formal or informal, and just ensure the quality of the work. Do we have a question that we needed to address at this point, Hillary? I was just coming. I hit
The
stop.
The question was a very good question. Have they updated the self-assessment, the internal auditor self-assessment template?
I don't think they have.
Yeah,
I think that I may be wrong, but I don't think they have. But I think there is a plan to do that, and they're slowly. I'm sorry, Hillary.
I was just gonna say, what I saw on the website was the latest version was a 2017 version.
Yeah, so that will be updated, though. I saw somewhere there's a reference that entire process, both the external assessment and internal assessment tools would be updated, and they are slowly rolling out additional tools in general, such as the abbreviated standards. So as I mentioned on the front end, that just include the requirements, so that you don't have to read a whole 120 pages. There's also a document out there that bridges between. It's a matrix kind of thing that bridges between the IPPF and the new standards, so you can see the differences, that kind of thing. So, and that wasn't out there to begin with. That they're populating those things. So I'd stay close to that. Stay close to that web page. Principle 13. Plan engagements effectively. Internal auditors must communicate effectively throughout the engagement, must communicate objective, scope, and timing with management, which is standard stuff that we all need to be doing now, regardless of the global internal audit standards. Engagement risk assessment. There should be some type of formal or informal risk assessment at the engagement level. So you need to develop an understanding of the activity and, gain that information, gain sufficient information to and understanding such that you can assess risk at the engagement level. Each engagement should have clearly defined objectives and scope, and the engagement objectives must articulate the purpose of the engagement and describe the specific goals to be achieved. And the scope would establish things like, the engagement focus, the boundaries, the activities, locations, processes, systems, components, those types of things. So engagement objectives and scope development. And then the CAE must approve the engagement objectives and scope. I think that's actually what it says, but I'm sure that is something that is delegable. If that's a word, that is a word, delegable. That is delegable, I believe. Because obviously in a large shop, CAE can't approve every single audit. Evaluation criteria, standard 13.4, internal auditors must identify the most relevant criteria to be used to evaluate the aspects of activity under review. So you have the objectives, you have the scope, and then, what are your criteria? So if you're looking at a particular activity, what are you looking for? And also, the internal auditors have to assess the extent to which the board and senior management have established adequate criteria to determine whether activity under review has accomplished its objectives and goals. So, when I think of criteria, I think of like a policy. And probably in my world, in the financial services world, there's probably more policies and written procedures. In larger organizations, there's probably more rather than less. But developing the criteria and the expectation, because that's the benchmark that you're going to use in developing your testing and evaluating things. So you have to assess the necessary resources in consideration of the nature and complexity of the engagement, the time frame, and whether or not those resources are available, which is pretty standard stuff, right? We do that every day now, formally and informally. You have to have a work program that's based on the information obtained in planning and assessing risk. The program needs to identify the criteria to be used to evaluate the objectives, tasks to achieve the objectives, methodologies, and the internal auditors assigned. And of course, the CAE is charged with reviewing the program. Okay, 14.1. Gathering information for analysis and evaluation. To perform analysis and evaluation, the internal auditors must gather information that's both relevant and reliable. So relevant obviously means it's consistent with the objectives and scope of the engagement. And reliable, and going back earlier, I made reference to this, reliable, the information is factual and current, but I would also say reliable is probably complete. Is the information complete? Do I have everything I need? So relevance and reliability is important in conducting an audit engagement. Analyses and potential engagement findings. The internal auditor has to analyze information to determine whether there's a difference between the evaluation criteria and the existing state of the activity under review, known as the condition. So if there's a difference, so you have criteria, you're expecting per the policy, this is supposed to be happening. This is what's happening. There's a gap between those. The difference between the two is the condition. The internal auditor then must determine if the condition, the condition by using the information and evidence gathered during the engagement. And a difference between the two indicates a potential engagement finding or recommendation or whatever terminology you use. So criteria and condition. Pretty standard stuff. Evaluating findings. This is kind of an interesting part of to the standards to me, because there's, in addition to talking about how the CAE needs to collaborate and interact with senior management, and not just saying that, not just that being intuitive, but that's embedded in the standards, that there will be an interaction and cooperation and putting that ownership with CAE. In evaluation of findings, there's collaboration, not necessarily with senior management, but with management. So the internal auditor must collaborate with management to identify root causes when possible, determine the potential effects, and evaluate the significance. To determine the significance, internal auditors must consider the likelihood of the risk occurring and the impact. So there has to be, the internal auditor is required to work with management to identify root cause and then to assess significance. And of course, not a foreign concept, the likelihood and impact needs to be evaluated when looking at that. And if the internal auditors determine that the organization is exposed to a significant risk, it must be documented and communicated as a finding. Recommendations and action plans. One of the things, so again, going back to the collaboration thought process, internal auditors have to determine whether to develop recommendations, request action plans for management, so you either need to have a recommendation, request an action plan from management, or collaborate with management on action to resolve the difference between the criteria and condition, mitigate identified risk to an acceptable level, address the root cause, enhance or improve the activity under review. So that's a little bit different than, say, certainly as an external provider in terms of the collaboration. So it says, hey, you either need to develop the recommendation and ask management for an action plan of how they're going to do it, or you can collaborate with management to resolve the difference, mitigate the risk, address the root cause, and possibly enhance or improve the activity under review. So that's standard 14.4 if you want to look at that a little closer. Engagement conclusions. The engagement conclusion must summarize the internal auditor's professional judgment about the overall significance of the aggregated engagement findings. So you have to conclude over the whole engagement, as opposed to, say, certain methodologies now where you say and this is a must. So you do the work and you say, here are the things we found, and maybe you risk rate those or something, but you don't necessarily have an overall conclusion to that audit, because that's certainly the way certain companies and firms do it now. But this is saying you have to have an overall conclusion and the overall significance of regarding the aggregation of the engagement findings. Assurance engagements, and that's all we've really been talking about is assurance engagements. But assurance engagements must include the internal auditor's judgment regarding the effectiveness of governance, risk management, and control processes. So you have to have an overall conclusion, and you have to conclude. Have to conclude for assurance engagements. You have to conclude regarding the effectiveness of GRC. Standard 14.6 engagement documentation. You must the analysis, evaluations, and supporting information relevant to the engagement must be documented such that an informed, prudent internal auditor or similarly informed and competent person could repeat the work and derive the same engagement results. So your analysis, evaluations, and support needs to be sufficient that if I were to look at it, or someone knowledgeable were to look at it, well, I might not be knowledgeable. Depends on what the subject matter is. But I should be able to look behind you, understand what you did, why you did it, and what you concluded, otherwise known as the reperformance standard. Engagement documentation should be reviewed for accuracy, relevance, and completeness. That's the quality control. Okay, last standard, standard 15 under communicate engagement conclusions and monitor action plans. And I'm looking around because I'm just looking at my times. Standard 15.1, for each engagement, internal auditors need to develop a final communication that includes the objectives, the scope, the recommendations, and the action plans. The final communication for assurance engagements also must include the following: the findings and their significance, an explanation of any scope limitations, and a conclusion regarding the effectiveness of GRC. So that's a repeat from what I just said, but they're driving it home. The final communication must specify the individuals. So this is new. This is not in the IPPF. The final communication must specify the individuals responsible for addressing the findings and the planned date. Now, a lot of us do that now, and I say us, we're an external provider, so we don't tell management if they're going to have management action plans. That's up to management, and the board. But it's requiring that you have request an action plan incorporated into your deliverable, and ensure there's a due date for it. And last bullet, if the internal auditor determines management's already addressed the item before final issuance of the report, then that should be included in that communication. And then standard 15.2, last but not least, internal auditors must confirm that management has implemented internal audit recommendations or management action plans. So, and that's on, it says, essentially you can do that on a test basis, some kind of risk basis. That's certainly not part of the existing IPPF as far as requiring management have an action plan, incorporating it into your deliverable, and then having a follow-up process. Now, I'm not saying that people don't do that, but it certainly is done in practice, but it's not required, and it's not always part of an internal audit function and their interaction with management.
Hey, Doug, we actually have a question now that this question slot popped up.
Oh, nice.
Does the communication require an action date if management disagrees with the recommendation?
Now, I don't know if they don't agree with it. I think that's that kind of
That's another conversation, right?
Yeah, I think that goes back to, and I don't remember exactly which standard, but I think that goes back to escalation. So if you can't come to an agreement with management about the fact that there is a condition, that a reportable condition, or the severity of that, or maybe you agree there's an issue, they just disagree as to the action plan, or they disagree as to timeline or something like that, I think you would have to escalate it to senior management. And then if you can't get satisfaction there, you elevate it to the board, so that ultimately you have an action plan, or the board takes responsibility for management not taking action. I mean, at some point, governance, it has to be part of that process.
So if there's any more questions, or if you have questions that come up, this next slide gives Doug's information or my information. If you'd like to reach out, please feel free. And then here is our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn at CRI CPA. No dot, excuse me, CRI CPA.
Two Q&A popped up.
Oh, they sure did. Well, have you seen an example of the mandate?
I have not seen an example of a mandate, but I think that is actually it's the roles, responsibilities, and et cetera. And so that would be, there are a lot of internal audit shops that have what is essentially policies and procedures. It's the roles and responsibilities and how you're going to carry out your duties. So I think there are some tools out there, but specifically, have I seen at this point, have I seen a developed internal audit mandate? No. But I also say that we as a firm, we're a top 25 firm and a regional firm. So we serve the middle market. And so we don't work with, large money center banks, for instance. So while they might have something in place, the folks we work with on a day-to-day are not there yet. Not to scope aside any work here, but we just don't deal with the largest companies in the country. So we hadn't seen it yet, but I'm sure people are working on it. Of course, these are fresh. I mean, the internal audit mandate was in the draft, but even the draft hadn't been out a year. The draft was issued in March, so nobody saw this. It's been almost, we're approaching a year for the draft. Most people wouldn't have taken a lot of action, I wouldn't think, or invested a lot of time until it was final. And we've been final about 50 days, if I did the math right.
Yeah. Well, the other questions were really saying, good job. The presentation was good. So
Well, good.
That's
Well, listen,
always good to do.
we appreciate you all joining us today. We know you could have done a lot of different other things than invest an hour with us. So we hope you found it worthwhile. The slides are a good takeaway. Again, they're derived directly from the standards, and we give credit appropriately. But maybe it serves as a Cliff Note version, if you will, rather than reading 60 full pages or 120 full pages. And with that, I think we're
Wonderful. Yeah.
done. Okay.
Everybody
Thank
have a
you.
good day. Thank you.